All right, welcome everyone. Hopefully you've had a great day and had a chance to tune into some of the other amazing sessions. I always love tuning into these because the topics are super relevant and then the experts that speak are always on point. So this session will be just like that. We've got a great lineup here. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists in a second. But again, just wanted to just welcome everyone. If you have not used this platform before, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A piece and we will get to them as we can. If you would like to, in the chat, say where you're from, say a little hello, we use the chat section for that. So please use the tool in that way. So we're going to go about, a little under an hour. Okay, so I just want to say before we also get into this, thank you to our sponsor, Trusted Computing Group. Couldn't do this again without you and your support. So without further ado, would like to introduce the topic for this last session. It's called Incident Response and Recovery in Supply Chain, Building Resilience Against Cyber Threats. And some of the things that we're going to talk about are really getting insights into how do you develop robust incident response plans, how do you become more resilient as an organization, and how do you make sure that you're maintaining integrity of your entire supply chain operations as things are getting more and more complex. Even this morning, I was talking with some other people about AI and how that's changing the face of how we interact with everything. So there's a lot of complexity here, and I think it's great that we're having dialogue about this. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. He is Thorsten Stremlau. He's a systems principal architect and CISSP from NVIDIA. Thorsten's career has been marked by a rich history in leading customer operations and managing large-scale global IT projects. He has a lot of expertise in steering customer-led innovation into IoT solutions with a background in security, manageability, and advanced AI. He has over 30 patents and is a recognized thought leader in the field. Welcome, Thorsten.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes. And next we have Molly Breen. She is the founder and CEO of Perigee. So Perigee is a cybersecurity company, and it reimagines how enterprises secure operational technology. So yet another emerging space these days. Before starting Perigee, Molly was a mathematician at the National Security Agency, the NSA. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And lastly, we have Ariel Parnes. He is the CEO and co-founder of Matiga. So he's a retired colonel of the Israel Defense Forces 8200 Cyber Unit, where he served over 20 years in a wide variety of roles in the areas of intelligence, information technology, offensive and defensive cyber operations, and cyber warfare. So don't mess with him. He was awarded the prestigious Israel Defense Prize for technological breakthroughs in the cyber field. Really glad to have you as well, Ariel. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so again, folks, put your questions in the Q&A section, and we're going to go ahead and get started with a couple of pre-seeded questions that we've kind of pulled together. So firstly, Molly, I'd like to hand it over to you. And I think if you could maybe just start us off with a bigger picture about incident response and recovery, and specifically, why is it different in supply chain businesses compared to others? If you could maybe start us off with that one.
Absolutely. Why is it different than in other businesses? One of the things that I think is so unique and so exciting about supply chain businesses, but becomes one of these challenges then when we start talking about incident response and recovery, is just the amount of diversity that it has to be managed and the relationships amongst all of these different components. And what I mean by that is it's not just diversity in terms of the number of different stakeholders that you're thinking about, from vendors to people to other parts of the organization, but also in terms of the IT systems that have to be managed, all the way down to the OT systems, the operational technology. And at every single place in one of these layers, we're talking about so many variations of types and controls that live within that. So those are the big things. And then you take that a step further when you think about how much complexity is in this space. The consequences are really real. We're talking about, in some situations, the loss of the ability to generate revenue, and we've seen some real impacts across the globe of the repercussions when we think about where there have been disruptions. But and then unfortunately, this can go as far as being some type of loss of human life. And so when I think about incident response within supply chain, it's really the amalgamation of all of those different things coming together that you may not see in different aspects of the commercial world.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Yeah. Does anyone have any other thoughts they'd like to add to that? If not, I have a further question to kind of go deeper into it. So let's talk a little bit about how things have evolved. Okay. So maybe Thorsten, I'll pass it over to you. If you think about, obviously in your experience, you've seen a lot of different things. The world has changed. So how has it evolved over the past, maybe we can say decade, but if you want to even go back further to give context, tell us how things have changed.
Well, a whole bunch of things have changed in this space. Number one is obviously, especially in the globalization. Well, I guess there's two different aspects: globalization. Then there's also another thing that I call glocalization, which is also the aspect of where countries and trades are trying to bring some of the global trade back into into more local, locally sourced goods, right? So. As the global supply chain evolved a while ago, many different environments introduced a whole bunch of levels of certification, testing that go beyond just simply a technical test or an integration test of something into their products, but now even makes, as Molly was saying, makes the supply chain even more complex than what we saw before, right? There's already the complexity of sourcing. Where do I get it from? What do I pay for it? Is it available? And then does it match my requirements? And now we add this whole other stuff to it. So that's been kind of the evolution of the supply chain over a while. And then COVID happened.
Mm.
And then COVID happened, and COVID really, COVID had a huge impact on the supply chain, disruptive, very, very disruptive, right? Certain states and facilities that we all relied on to supply us with whatever good it was, right? I mean, there are nail shortages, there's chip shortages, there were shortages of all kind, just about everywhere around the world. And this introduced a whole bunch of new complexity because it opened the doors to some, ingenious hacking and to some other, bad actors, right? And so during COVID, one of the things that we saw is actually a establishment of professional supply chain hacking organizations. There are whole manufacturing plants all around the world that now specialize in desoldering chips, random chips off of the TV set that you got rid of 2 years ago. They will simply desolder those chips, and then basically what they do is they wipe the little sticker off that tells, and then they kind of match it by the amount of legs that come out of it, and about the approximate size, and they'll stick some new sticker on it. Maybe they'll put an NVIDIA logo on it. And by the way, that's a little bit harder to do because our chips are a little bit more complex, right? But let's say they now put an NVIDIA sticker on it, and guess what? They sell it back into the market, and by the time it actually hits the market or the person that's trying to integrate that chip into their environments, it's already 5, 6, 10 times removed from that hacking factory that did the original desoldering. And it's really, really hard to prove where that came from. And by the way, we could take it a step further and now even go into malicious, so not just making money off of this, in terms of restamping, but now also introducing, and I'm sure that Ariel and Molly will have something to say about this, but now introducing fake code into these chips that allows hackers to then enter into a product and enter into OT technology in an energy producing facility or things like it. So in a nutshell, I was trying to do a short answer there. Over the last 10 years, it's gone and gotten more or attempted to be more and more secure. And then COVID came and kind of dismantled all of that. And so we're now stuck with the complexity that we introduced a couple of years ago, but we're also stuck with these new bad actors in the supply chain.
Yeah, really interesting. That's kind of scary too. That, you know, I think for as much as we try to build security and build processes in and get better, there's a whole set of people that are out there trying to break that down. Like that is their entire mission is to hack into the systems and the safeguards and the processes that we put in place. So this is a never-ending battle almost. So any other thoughts? Maybe Molly, how have you seen, you know, the nature of how we respond to these then change? Is there any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think Thorsten touched on this a little bit that I would expand on is, you know, giving the example of like there's now code injection that people are worried about. It's a lot harder to find the source, and I think when the world was maybe simpler and there were only so many places a hacker could enter, and traditionally on the IT side, then you know the source could only be in so many number of places, and the systems that you were using, the tools that you were using, had easy access to figuring out, you know, which one of the systems a hacker came into. When we look at what the landscape looks like today, and with the introduction of new threat vectors and with the introduction of new devices, finding the source of where they entered and getting to the core in an incident response event, then that's one area where I'm seeing it start to evolve and be a lot more difficult than when it was decades ago.
Makes sense. So Ariel, I want to pull you into the conversation too. I know you have some experience here, and we were talking earlier about implications of the SEC rules regarding like disclosing of these incidents and all that. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I think in a sense what we are hearing here is, you know, from one side we have this pressure of change happening, you know, from the enemy side, from the criminal side, that is putting pressure on our industry. But surprisingly, we also get pressure from the regulators. And what happened a few months ago is that the SEC published their new rule for cybersecurity regarding cybersecurity disclosure. I don't want to go into too many details, but basically what this rule says, and by the fact it's starting in about 7 days to be active, what it means is that organizations have to inform or declare when or report within 4 days after identifying a cyber attack, or if I want to be more accurate, after identifying what they refer to as a material cybersecurity event or a material series of cybersecurity events. Now, even if I just look at this few words, this is also showing the kind of a change or evolution in our area from the other side, from the regulator side. First and foremost, when they say a cyber security incident, it is not the traditional way of thinking of a malicious activity necessarily. So the SEC, and let's take the SEC as a reference for the regulators in the world. And the Europeans are even more strict in some areas and others, but let's take the SEC as an example. The regulator is demanding us in the industry to report on cybersecurity events, but they don't just expect malicious activities to be reported, but also even just configurations, bad configurations that could be utilized by attackers or by others that don't have the authority to do that, or shouldn't have the authority or the permission to do that. So this opens a whole world of definitions on what is that organizations need to report to the regulators when they are dealing with a cyber event, with a crisis. A second one is the materiality, which to me is a super important topic that will be discussed in the coming months and years, and we'll see a lot of it happening around it, which is the SEC and the regulators are saying, we want to hear about every cyber incident that is material. Now, what exactly is materiality? They leave it to others to define, and then you can go back to previous cases dealt in court. But basically, it means whatever as our investors believe that it's important for them to know that puts in risk their investment. And now the question is, or the onus is on us in the industry to be able to assess this materiality fast enough so that we can report or decide not to report if it makes sense. To make it even simpler, if it wasn't simple enough now, it adds yet another level of complexity, because not only us in the industry are aware of it, but also the criminals are aware of it. And so they are planning, and they actually are doing already, they are planning to leverage that pressure from the SEC and the regulator to get what they want to get. A couple of weeks ago, we heard about a huge event. The victim in this case was breached. The attacker demanded payment of ransomware. The victim didn't pay, and so the attacker, to force the victim to pay, reported the criminals, reported to the SEC about the breach. We're going to see much more of it. This is crazy.
Yeah.
And so we're going to see much more of it. And I think we need to start thinking as an industry how we prepare for this moment where, this kind of a dialogue and pressure that we're getting, not only from the criminals, but also from the regulators, with a great intent, but quite a lot of implications.
So interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So I've been looking at the chat here over on the side. We have a couple questions. So again, I think maybe if we have any links to these new regulations, or we can maybe type up some of those things that you mentioned there, Ariel, that would be awesome. While you're doing that, perhaps some people here asking about IIoT specifically, maybe how do we think about ensuring security in these devices, because there's a variety of protocols. Another question kind of involved design and deployment of PLCs. So maybe if you guys can give some general thoughts about that, more from the design and development perspective of some of these industrial components, and or maybe configuration of those components. How can you give advice to operators and integrators about how to do that preventatively?
Ellen, if you don't mind, I'd like to take the hardware side of things from a TCG perspective.
Yeah.
So this is actually, this is something that the TCG, the Trusted Computing Group, that's what we stand for, has been working on for a very, very long time. Is actually, how do I establish trust in my IIoT environment from a hardware perspective, right? So, obviously there are certain functions that you can put in. At these events, what I always say is, by the way, this technology has been around for 25 years. And specifically, the area of industrial IoT is the one that's probably the most negligent at integrating trusted technology into their products. And that's typically, by the way, from a development perspective, because the drive is to provide a solution as quickly as possible. And then the afterthought is typically put into a security perspective, right? That's always the problem that we face is, all right, let's design the product. Let's get it out there. Oh, it has to be cheap too. Oh, but what about security? Oh, we'll add this little thing in the back, to attempt to make it secure. We realize that at TCG. So a couple of things that we've done is, number one is we've evolved the TPM specification, which actually required a dedicated chip in these IoT devices. And there's several different standards. One of them is called MARS, and another one is called DICE. These are much simpler standards that you can implement even in the easiest of thermometer IIoT devices, right? Really, really low cost devices. And then secondly, there's another thing, and Ariel just spoke about it, complexity. Companies that operate industrial IoT devices, they're not in the business of cybersecurity. They're in the business of what they're in the business of, right? Producing energy, making furniture, whatever, right? But they're not in the business of cybersecurity. And by the way, there's much too big a cybersecurity shortage to be able to put an expert in every industrial IoT company that exists in the world. Okay. So this is where, again, from a TCG perspective, and I can definitely put the link in place. One of the things that we've done is we've actually published a standard called the CIRES standard, which is specifically targeted at industrial IoT. And it basically is a standard that describes how you do a root of trust measurement on an industrial IoT device. You go through the boot phase, you measure each of the phases, you make sure that none of the hardware was changed, you make sure that none of the firmware was changed. You can then go on to the next level and check to see whether all of your software is okay, whether your protocols are all secured, all those different types of things, that goes in line with what these questions were asking about. And if the device detects, or if the system detects that there's something wrong with this device, it'll simply prevent it from coming online and will then recover it to a known good state, right? Mm-hmm. And that's part of it, in some of these cases, as Ariel was saying, is, what? Okay, so my device was breached, but I can prove that it didn't have an impact. There was no impact of it, right? Mm-hmm. And that's basically it. That's exactly what we're trying to do, is we're trying to make it as easy as possible for a variety of IIoT organizations and implementers to remain secure in their environments, right? And that I'm hoping provides a little bit of insight here is how we apply that into an IIoT environment. So do take a look at the DICE, the MARS. We love acronyms in TCG, and also have a look at the CIRES standard. Okay.
Awesome. That was super helpful. Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit to if Thorsten mentioned the hardware side, I'll speak to more of like the networking software side, and the reason to speak to that is I think there's a lot of, I'm sure there's some organizations out there that may not be cycling over their devices as much, or maybe they have some device that's been there, to your point, 25 years, and they'd like it to stay for another 25 years. Typically, IIoT, I typically think of as being a bit more new age, where switching out the hardware chip can make sense, but people have different definitions for IoT. So in a situation where it doesn't make sense to have a new chip, like there's still things you can do to secure it. And let's see, some of the things that we've seen is having some basic monitoring in place that just helps understand if this device is being used in the way that you expect it to be being used. Is it talking to the devices that it should be talking to? And for some of these devices that are I would say a little bit more finicky, don't want to be touched, like you have to be really gentle. If you can be really targeted about talking to those devices on the protocol that they talk on. And this is something that we do at Perigee, where that can help provide some of that information on, does it have the right firmware? Does it have a default password? What ports are open? And then part of an incident response plan can be close, switching out the default password, updating the firmware if you can. If you can't update the firmware, put in some compensating controls around it. So just to say that if for some reason putting in a better hardware application doesn't make sense, there's other things around it that can do it. It's not a total loss if it doesn't make sense for your environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Since it sounded so simple until now, so I want to add yet another layer of complexity. So we were talking about the hardware, we were talking about the software. Let's talk about the cloud. Many of these devices are connected either directly or indirectly to the cloud. And so, and the cloud is definitely a part of the environment that is both a target and both an area of focus for us to defend as practitioners. And I want to say a few words about the uniqueness of the cloud. First and foremost, the cloud is everywhere, even when we are aware of it, and most of the time we're not aware of it. And so our devices at home, our devices in the office, and devices in the industry in general, report to the cloud, connect to the cloud, either if it is our own cloud in our own environment, or to the vendor, or to some command and control environments, and so on and so forth. So even when we think that we have a clear understanding of the perimeter of our environment, we need to take into consideration that some part of it includes a wider environment of the cloud. The uniqueness of the cloud is that from one side, it provides the cutting edge technology in terms of services and infrastructure, and allows much more than what we could do before we had the cloud on our own premises, but it also introduces a new term that is very risky, and it is shared responsibility. We use that term in the industry to explain that in terms of cybersecurity, we and the cloud vendors share responsibility on different things. Now, the huge risk with the term share responsibility is when both sides believe that the other should be responsible for something. Then it means that there is nobody responsible, right? And so this is a very important topic that we as practitioners need to be clear internally and with our peers. Where is our responsibility as users of the cloud? Where does it start? Where does it end? And basically, without going into too many details, it starts very early and it ends very late or far away from what we could imagine. And so basically, as users, either being aware of not being aware of it, as users of the cloud, cloud providers, SaaS applications, platforms, we're definitely owning the responsibility of defending our own environment, leveraging what the cloud providers do, but making sure that we understand the implications of it, preparing in advance, and being able to include that in our plans of incident response. And I can go into the details. This is, we live and breathe incident response in the cloud in Medica, but it requires an expertise. It requires certain things that you don't think about in your on-premise environment. For example, making sure that you have footprints, you collect the footprints, what we call the telemetry, and store it ahead of time. Otherwise, you won't even be able to conduct an investigation. Therefore, you won't be able to respond to an incident. These are things that are taken for granted in your own environment, but they don't happen in the cloud if you don't do that in advance, if you don't understand what the meaning, the implications are, and you have the right solution. So yet another layer of complexity out there.
Thank you. I think that covered all of it, right? And hopefully there's no more complexity then. Thank you. Great. Okay, so let's shift a little bit. Thorsten, I want to go back to you. We were talking the other day about why these supply chain attacks are so complicated to detect. And I think you were kind of referencing a NIST guideline here. So maybe can you answer and kind of share a little bit more about this?
Well, so regardless of if it's IIoT or anything else like that, supply chains are just really, really complicated, right? And we could take a look at a supply chain from any kind of perspective, right? We could take a look at it from a security perspective. We can also take a look at it from an ESG perspective, right? So, corporate social responsibility, right? So, for example, how do you make sure that the product that you sourced is responsibly sourced, right? It didn't involve child labor. And there's been a whole bunch of new regulatory requirements that have been put into place just for that, right? And then taking a look at many other different aspects. There is a particular standard, NIST SP 800-161. Which is one of the more comprehensive NIST documentations. Excuse me, and it really starts. It shows the complexity of the supply chain, right? You might be sourcing. Let's say again, I'm going to stay in the IT world. You might be sourcing a graphics subcomponent for your display, right? That's basically what you're doing. But that subcomponent that you're sourcing is actually made up of 10 or 12 other subcomponents that your providers also already sourced from, another 10 sub providers, right? And so typically in a supply chain, in any supply chain, the actual manufacturer of a product will go about 2 deep, right? It'll go from one particular vendor or subcomponent provider to maybe one afterwards. but the supply chain is immediately lost after that. And in those steps before that, thousands and thousands of different vulnerabilities can be introduced into the product, whether it's software vulnerabilities, deliberate, or by simply because that subcomponent provider didn't have the skills. And by the way, that's one of the things that's actually the biggest worry. That's the thing that keeps me up at night, is people who have the best intentions and yet still design huge vulnerabilities into their software. Or by the way, just simply design or add things into their software, open source software, that you never find out about because they never provided the software bill of material to let you actually establish that. Now a vulnerability comes out, and Ariel was saying, you know what? All right, I'm now going to disclose I have this vulnerability, and everybody now knows it's this software module that caused the vulnerability, right? As Ariel was saying, I've done my bit. I'm great. I don't have to pay any fines to SEC. But now, by the way, how is, and Molly, I'm not picking on you, I promise, absolutely. But how does Molly know that her software isn't using that piece of software that I was using that has a vulnerability, right? And it's going to take her, if she doesn't have the right skills and the right processes in place, might take her months to find out. And guess what? She'll have a vulnerability for those months. So those are the complexities that are added into this scenario. And by the way, again, Molly, I really didn't mean to pick on you. I just use you as an example there. Okay. These are the complexities that companies are running into. Is the supply chain is extremely complex. It's varied. They only go about 2 deep. And then, by the way, many people don't even know that they have that vulnerability and can't figure it out fast enough to be able to make a difference.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. So let's shift a little bit and talk about maybe how to develop an incident response and recovery program. What are the things that go into it? Because we talked a lot about the risks and the complexity and all of that, and a little bit about the IIoT devices and best practices there. But when it comes to these programs, and Molly, maybe I'll start with you because I think you have a lot of experience. How do you structure that? Where do you tell people to start, and what are the key pieces to think about?
Yeah, and I think all of us have a lot of experience, and I'm excited to hear what some of the other panelists have to say. But when I think about some of the most important things that go into an incident response program, there are 2 things that come to mind. I think the first one is around prioritization, and it's really easy to be like, we're gonna do incident response, and if you open up the floodgates, you're gonna notice that there's a lot of things you could be chasing and a lot of things to focus on. And prioritization, if I go a bit deeper in terms of how to implement it, there's a lot of different ways to implement prioritization. And I think that sometimes prioritization can feel really academic, like you want to boil the whole ocean and you want to figure out, okay, what vulnerabilities do I have? Like what's in this software? How do I, figure out the relative impact based on its use, or whether there's an exploit that lives in the wild. And there's entire droves of machine learning algorithms and AI that can do that. And there might even be people on this call that are working on it. But I wouldn't miss that there's a lot you can do today as an organization. So just by thinking about what are the 3 to 5 most important things that we're doing as a human today to prioritize vulnerabilities, because you're probably doing it without realizing it. Like you're looking at something and saying yes or no, whether you're gonna do anything about it or not, and thinking about how you might encode that into some type of process. And the reason I say that is in part just because otherwise it can feel like a really intractable problem. And getting buy-in from the right stakeholders and how you might do things, and not forgetting that there's sort of these initial steps you can do just to encode some of the human elements that you might already be doing in the prioritization aspect of it. And then this sort of, I mentioned that there were 2 buckets, two big things, but I'm sure I'm not like, there's a lot more we could talk about. But when I think about the next piece of it would be around some level of automation, thinking about the prioritization that you're doing. And if you're doing it manually today, if it's all sort of looking at a vulnerability and thinking about yes, no on a couple of 3 to 5 different criterias, putting into place some type of automation. It can be an incident response tool, but there's a lot of really generic tools that are out there too that just make it really easy to get started on how you might sift through the noise of what is in the network and some of the signal that you're getting. And one reason we haven't talked about this as much, but I'm willing to bet a lot of people on this call know they should be doing more automation or would like to be doing more automation. So the easier the easier it is to get started by just focusing on a couple of entry points versus trying to automate everything is the other aspect of where this can help get started.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I completely agree that prioritization is the kind of the anchor that we need to hold or start with. When I look at building, or when I work with our customers on building their incident response program, one of the messages is that to be careful not to take too big of a bite at once. And so my approach is iterative. Our approach is iterative. And the first step of the iteration, from my perspective, is to have an incident response plan. What is an incident response plan? Basically, it's a document that guides the organization during an incident. And it holds, or it has a few topics, but the most important ones are definitions. What is an incident in our organization? When we say, for example, we have an incident commander, what does it mean? What does it mean to us, materiality of an incident? And so on and so forth. There are a few terms that we need to make sure that our organization internally is aligned, so that we have a common language that we can use, a terminology that we can use across different departments. The other milestone or component in that document is roles and responsibilities. And one important thing that I always emphasize with our customers and in the industry is that when we think about incident response plan or an incident response process, we think, as practitioners in cybersecurity, we think, or we look at it as a cybersecurity focused topic, but actually managing an incident or managing a crisis goes way outside the cybersecurity practice of the organization. During a crisis, there are people involved, not just from the cybersecurity, or even not mainly from the cybersecurity practice, also PR and marketing and HR and legal and regulation and business and operation and so on and so forth. And so with this, once we have this document and it is clear to the organizations what role and responsibility our HR leader has during a crisis, during a cyber incident, it's trivial to us as in security that we have a role, but is it trivial for the HR person to know what is their role and their responsibility? And so having that in document, to me, is one of the essential components of it. And then I think we can move to the next step of the iteration, which is exercise. And I'm a strong believer in exercising. With my military background, you couldn't expect anything else from me, right? And so I think that basically the idea of taking a process, a procedure, and just exercising it, trying to play, a game where you assume that this is happening, and you sit around the table and spend an hour in the organization trying to figure out what to do in a certain scenario and see. First and foremost, it raises awareness in the organization, but also identify the gaps in your plan, or identify the gaps in the ability of the organization to implement the plan as it is defined. So you can have certain procedures in place or roles and responsibilities in place, but then you realize that the person doesn't have the knowledge or expertise, or you don't have the tools. And so this phase where we exercise, it's not so complicated to run a tabletop exercise. You can definitely get that from vendors, but you can do that internally very easily. And you can download some ideas from CISA and other organizations where they guide you on how to do that. So you have a plan, you run the exercise, and then you identify the gaps, either in people, processes, or technology. And then you prioritized based on the idea, on the approach that Molly mentioned before, and you prioritize and you pick what is it you're going to do first: automation, tooling, building your ecosystem, for example. Do you have the connections with the law enforcement, with the regulator that you need during an incident, and so on and so forth? And then you go back to updating your plan and running another tabletop exercise. And every time you do that, you improve significantly. And then every time you do that, you raise awareness. And I think that this, and you do that in in a way that you can digest that and not be overwhelmed of the complexity that we just talked about. And so again, the iterative approach to me is super important.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that was a great comment there, that it is a shared sort of responsibility, and there's different roles within the organization, and it's not only just the sole responsibility of the one cybersecurity person to develop this, and it's more iterative. Maybe this is just an off the top of my head question, but any other resources or communities that you all have found to be really helpful for sharing best practices like this? Like, is there some sort of forum or some following out there that you would recommend as a resource?
The first one that comes to mind is the CISA, is the organization CISA, with their website, where they have great guidelines, documentation, and also not too complex. And so it's a good starting point, a very good starting point for practitioners to get some reference and start working on. I would strongly recommend starting there. And then, the sky's the limit, and I'm sure that there are tons of vendors, if not more than that, that would be happy to elaborate on every single different aspect of it.
Right.
And I have to say, is another thing that's really, really valuable in that space. But by the way, I do want to. I'll mention a funny thing around the exercise, because there's, I went through one that was very surprising. But before I go there, the local trade shows, local exhibitions, for your particular trade, right? If it's, I have to say is that more and more security companies that are specializing in each of the verticals are obviously also attending these shows in order to be able to deliver services, but then also be able to deliver some very, very basic training. And I want to use an example, unfortunately, from a service that I used to work for a company that offered, pen testing services and all sorts of other different types of things like it. One of the things that they did is that, they found out that there were some firmware vulnerabilities in the IIoT environment. And so, what did they do? Is they went and they said, all right, let's do this. We're going to notify everyone that there was a vulnerability, and they notified everyone there was a vulnerability. And then they simply did an update of the manufacturing floor with a remote update of all the firmware. Well, it turns out, obviously, some of these operators that were out on the manufacturing floor were watching the devices, and were watching the devices come up, and then the little bars go across the screen that showed that the firmware was being updated. Well, they looked at it, and we've now all watched hundreds and hundreds of Hollywood movies. So what's the one thing that all Hollywood movies have in common, that when somebody's being hacked, it's some sort of a DOS screen that has something that moves and that counts down. So all these operators in the manufacturing plant turned off all of the devices while they were in the middle of the firmware update.
Uh-oh.
And if that's right, and if that's one of the things that you don't like, if that's one thing that an electronic device doesn't like, is it doesn't like to be turned off in the middle of a firmware update. So this little unplanned exercise, Ariel, as you hinted the importance, cost the company over 1.5 million in downtime, because they now had to get somebody in to fix all of these devices that had bad firmware due to people turning them off mid-flash. So you can't underestimate the value of education for your end users and for the operators in this either.
Totally. Completely agree. Completely agree.
It's really hard to follow that. But one other example of communities out there, this is I'm sure many people know about the ISACs that exists for every industry, but they do a great job bringing together people at all levels to collaborate on these issues and do regularly do events. So.
Cool. Really helpful. I always like to kind of ask that question, or, what are people reading? What are your sources? So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so just reaching out to the crowd again. If you have any more questions, please put them in the Q&A. I do have one here that I wanted to get to, because we also can't have a webinar these days without talking about AI. So let's want to get your thoughts about how could AI really be used to assist in protecting us from supply chain attacks. What have you guys seen that's tangible and that's real, or what's practical? What are your thoughts on this?
Uh-oh. All right. Well, I'll take it first, please, guys. You can't leave me alone on this one. This is too big a topic. So obviously, from my perspective, there's many things that are happening right now, especially in this space. The one thing that AI is really good at is detecting patterns in what humans can't, in data and in information that is where patterns are really hard to find. And that's basically, forget generative AI and somebody, answering an email automatically. That's not it. The one big thing that we're seeing right now are, for example, the automatic analysis of software bill of materials, right? So that you can see that has something changed in the software, and can I identify some sort of vulnerable code in that, or can I identify vulnerable open source modules that make up my software and what I'm using. The other big one that we're also seeing a big evolution of is simply predictive threat intelligence, right? So, this is currently affecting, and again, I'm just going to use some example, you know, all of the equipment of the company Siemens, and I'm GE, right? And so, being able to see the evolution of a particular threat, and be able to preempt that threat in my environment, you'll notice that certain threats will always have these evolutions, right? And so that's one of the things that, again, AI is just really good at. And then lastly, and then I'm going to hand it over, are then things like and then doing automatic threat response, right? So having a system that's intelligent enough to be able to respond intelligently to a threat in the organization or in your IIoT environment, that doesn't completely shut everything down. Now, wait, I want to be very clear, because I've said this a number of times. AI will not replace a human. Absolutely not. Will never. Well, not. I'm not going to say never, but won't replace humans for quite a long time. But it just helps take that burden off of the organization. So, again, it's really good at detecting patterns in data. Use that in your particular environments in order to mitigate IIoT threats and attacks.
Yeah, I agree with the analysis, and I want to take that and also reflect on the implications of it for the other side, for the criminals. Every single step, every single idea that Thurston mentioned here has a counter side from the criminals. So the first one was automation, right? So, and definitely automation is something that we can achieve. By the way, quick comment. We've been in the industry working with AI for 3 decades, if not more than that. What changed now, other than the cloud and connectivity that allows this access to huge amount of data and volume and variety of data, is the generative AI. And that is a qualitative difference, not just a quantitative difference. Closing this comment, and I'll refer to it back in a second. The first one is automation, and definitely we can leverage AI and generative AI to automate processes of incident response investigation. We're doing it in Medica, automating, I wouldn't say 100% of the process, but a large portion of the process of investigation and threat hunting and detection. But the other side is doing the same. They are automating their own processes of attacking, generating the tools that they need and the processes, and automating the attacks. And so what we're seeing here is the both sides expanding. One side is able to do better defense faster. The other one is better to is able to increase their amount and quality of attack due to the automation. The other aspect of AI, or specifically generative AI, is what I would define as democratization of capabilities. It means that since generative AI allows a human communication with a machine in a level that we haven't seen in the past, it allows non-experts to leverage technology, leverage computers in a complete different way. Just to give a very concrete example, in Medica we have a POC where we can, discuss an investigation with our platform in plain English, asking questions and talking in English with our agent, which is translating it then to what we do behind the scenes in the investigation. So it means that you don't need to be a forensicator or a geek forensicator to leverage all the capabilities that the industry provides. You can do that with plain English. And it means that we will have more people being able to do more, which is great for the industry because we have a shortage of knowledge and expertise. And it means that people will be able to contribute in the industry faster and earlier than they used to in the past. And the second part of it is also the criminals are doing the same. So now criminals are able to leverage very powerful capabilities without being experts due to the democratization of the tools through AI.
Great points. I know. And it's so interesting to think about, especially with the generative piece. If you are trusting an algorithm or a model to create something or output content, how do you know that the origin of that was really real and not fake? And then if you're building all these things around it, it becomes this like snowball effect of something that then somebody else uses and then references. And so, yeah, that's so me also coming from a cybersecurity background here, thinking about how we establish that initial trust. You prove the origin of and the authenticity of it, and then you have a way to track how things are edited or modified over time. So, it's just like firmware updates. We don't just we don't flash it one time and then never change it. Like, it's going to be updated over time. So we have to have a proper way to validate who wrote that code. Should that code be uploaded to this device? The typical whole code signing and verification piece. But yeah, it's all about underlying digital trust, how you establish that. Otherwise you erode that, and then we don't know what to trust either way. So it's like, it's so interesting for us to think about, and how we have to make sure from a cybersecurity perspective that we're thinking along those lines too. Not just about how fast can we create some new fake image. It's just, okay, let's do it in the right way, the secure way. So it's great. Cool. Okay. Well, we are really getting out of time here. Are there any other questions here from the crowd? Maybe if I'd like to just throw it out to the panelists here, if there's just one last thought that you want to give, maybe a sentence or two, that would be great to kind of share and wrap up. So perhaps Molly, I'll throw it over to you. If there's like one thing you want people to take away from this, what would you say?
Wow. So it's not necessarily what to take away. It's one thing that maybe we haven't touched on as much, which is, there's a whole, we touched on it in the span of, I think Ariel mentioned it when we're thinking about the process being iterative, but we were thinking about the process being iterative and in terms of not boiling the ocean when it comes to putting together these plans. But I find it's really easy to add and always do more. It's a lot harder to reflect sometimes when you're in organizations and think about what could have what could you have done differently, or what could you have done better? And so I would just sort of leave people with this sense of like, just as much as you want to go forth and build a program and build it in sequence and build things one on top of one another, don't forget to look backwards and ask yourself and like do those postmortems to think about what could have looked differently as you're building it, so that each step is stronger than the one that was sitting on.
Awesome. That's a great tip. All right, Thorsten, what about you? Anything that we didn't cover that you want to leave the audience with?
I guess I think, to recap from my perspective, the supply chain is complex enough as it is, right? To add the complexity of cybersecurity and cyber threats into it makes it even more complicated and vastly more complicated. As Ariel and as Molly were saying, is there are standards bodies out there and organizations like NIST, like CISA, like others that have documented best practices and ways of doing this. Don't try to invent it again by yourself, right? That would basically be it. There are established best practices. Follow those best practices. Use standards as much as you can. Don't invest. Don't try to invent them from scratch. And that will help you along the way of securing your IIoT environment.
Awesome. Thank you. And Ariel, what would you leave us with today?
Yeah, I think that if I needed to say, to give one single recommendation to the industry, it would be if you're not doing it yet and didn't plan or don't have a plan to do that yet, I would strongly recommend to have a tabletop exercise as soon as possible. Start with that. If you're doing it or if you're planning to do that, pick the 1 or 2 main concerns that you have and introduce them in the tabletop exercise. It could be the SEC new regulation, it could be supply chain, it could be your cloud posture or cloud incident response program. Just introduce that into the tabletop exercise. It's easy to do, and it's super powerful in identifying the gaps and improving your readiness.
Awesome. Great points. Well, thank you all again for your amazing insights and your knowledge and expertise in this topic. And thank you for the sponsor for this one, Trusted Computing Group, or TCG, and also for the attendees for listening in and for the questions. I hope you had a great day, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.